The pain won't stop. You have to," he'd beg me. I was 18 years old, and that wasn't even the worst part. My name is Lurleen Walker. I'm 82 now, sitting here in this quiet house in Hollow Pine, Nebraska, where folks still wave from their porches, and the church bells ring every Sunday morning just like they did when I was young. Everyone around here knows me as the woman who raised 10 children, the one who bakes pies for the church social, and keeps the prettiest garden on Maple Street. They see me as blessed, as someone who lived the life every good Christian woman should want. But there's something I never told a soul in all these years, something that lived underneath every smile I gave at Sunday service, every batch of cookies I brought to the school fundraiser, every time someone called me lucky for having such a big, beautiful family. The truth is, those 10 children I love more than my own breath, they came from a marriage that wasn't what anyone thought it was. They came from a burden I carried every single day and night for 50 years, a secret that turned my body into medicine for a man's constant, unbearable pain. I've kept this story buried so deep that sometimes I wondered if it even really happened. But my bones remember. My heart remembers. And now, at 82, with the house empty and my time on this earth getting shorter, I've decided it's time to tell the truth about what happened behind the closed doors of what everyone thought was the perfect Christian marriage. Arthur's been gone 10 years now, and my children are grown with families of their own. But that young girl who said, "I do," at 18, she's still inside me, and her story deserves to be heard. So I'm going to tell you everything, from the very beginning, about how love can become a prison, and how sometimes the strongest thing a woman can do is simply survive what nobody else will ever know she endured. Come sit with me a while. Let me tell you about the heaviest secret I ever carried. And maybe, just maybe, my words will help someone else who's carrying their own. I need to tell you about Arthur before I tell you about the rest, because understanding him is the only way you'll understand how a young woman could end up living the life I lived for 5 decades. When I first laid eyes on Arthur Walker in the summer of 1961, he was everything a girl from Hollow Pine could dream of. Tall as an oak tree, with shoulders broad enough to carry the world and hands that looked like they could build anything or fix anything that was broken. He had this way of looking at you like you were the only person in the whole congregation, and when he smiled it was like the sun breaking through storm clouds. Every unmarried woman in town had their eye on him, but for some reason I'll never fully understand, he chose me. The courtship was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Arthur pursued me with an intensity that made my head spin. He'd show up at my daddy's farm every evening after his work at the grain elevator, sometimes bringing wildflowers he'd picked along the roadside, sometimes just bringing himself and that smile that made my knees weak. We'd sit on the porch swing while Mama and Daddy watched from the kitchen window, and he'd talk about our future like it was already written in stone. How we'd have a house full of children, how he'd provide for us, how we'd be the family everyone in town looked up to. But even then, during those sweet summer evenings with the cicadas singing and the air thick with the smell of honeysuckle, there was something underneath Arthur's affection that I couldn't quite name. An urgency that went beyond normal courting, a need that seemed to burn in him like a fever. When he kissed me goodnight, his hands would shake, and sometimes I'd catch him wincing like he was in pain. When I asked him about it, he'd just pull me closer and tell me how much he needed me, how I was going to save him from something he couldn't explain. I was 18 and foolish enough to think that being needed that desperately was the same thing as being loved completely. The wedding happened fast, faster than most folks in town thought proper. Arthur insisted we couldn't wait, that he couldn't stand to be apart from me any longer. My mama had her concerns, whispering to my daddy about young men who couldn't control themselves. But I silenced her worries with talk about true love and destiny. I thought Arthur's impatience was romantic. I thought his constant need for my touch, his restless nights, his urgent whispers about how I was the only one who could help him. I thought all of that was passion. We were married on a September morning in 1961, right there in the Oak Street Baptist Church, where I'd been baptized as a child. I wore my mama's wedding dress, which she'd altered to fit my smaller frame, and carried daisies from our own garden. Arthur looked handsome as a picture in his black suit. But I remember noticing how he kept shifting from foot to foot during the ceremony, how his jaw was clenched tight, how he gripped my hand so hard during the vows that I had marks on my fingers afterward. Our wedding night was supposed to be beautiful. That's what all the married women had told me in their hushed conversations. That it would be beautiful and special and the beginning of something wonderful. But Arthur came to our marriage bed with a desperation that frightened me. He was sweating, shaking, and kept apologizing over and over for something I didn't understand. He kept saying that the pain was getting worse, that he couldn't help it, that I was the only thing that gave him any relief at all. I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know that this was just the beginning. For the first month of our marriage, I told myself that Arthur's constant need for intimacy was normal for newlyweds. 3, 4, sometimes 5 times a day, he'd reach for me with that desperate look in his eyes, begging me to help him with the pain that never seemed to go away. I'd see him clutching his abdomen in the middle of the night, pacing the floor, and I'd think it was my wifely duty to comfort him however I could. But then came the morning when Arthur finally told me the truth about what was wrong with him, and everything I thought I knew about my marriage crumbled like a house built on sand. And that's when I learned that sometimes the worst prison is the one built with wedding vows, and blessed by God himself. It was on a cold October morning, about 6 weeks after our wedding, when Arthur finally found the courage to tell me what was really wrong with him. I was in the kitchen making breakfast, humming some hymn I'd heard at church the Sunday before, when I heard him calling my name from the bedroom. His voice sounded different, broken, like a man who'd been carrying a boulder on his shoulders for too long. I found him sitting on the edge of our bed, still in his nightclothes, his head buried in his hands. The morning light coming through our lace curtains made him look pale as a ghost, and when he looked up at me, I saw something in his eyes I'd never seen before. Not desire, not need, but pure, raw shame. He told me to sit down beside him, and when I did, he took my hands in his. They were shaking something fierce, and I could feel the calluses from his work at the grain elevator, rough against my palms. That's when he said the words that would change everything I thought I knew about being a wife. He told me he had a condition, a medical condition with a name I could barely pronounce. Priapism, he called it. Said it was something that happened to men sometimes, something that made his body stay in a state of arousal that caused him constant, unbearable pain. He'd had it since he was a teenager, he said, and it had only gotten worse over the years. The only relief he could find was through what we'd been doing as husband and wife. I sat there listening to him explain how he'd seen doctors in Lincoln, how they'd told him there wasn't much they could do except manage the symptoms, how he'd prayed every night for God to take this burden away from him. But the Lord seemed to have other plans, how he'd hoped that marriage, that having a wife who could help him regularly, might make it bearable. That's when it hit me like a lightning bolt to the chest. All those times he'd reached for me with tears in his eyes, all those moments when he'd whispered about how much he needed me. It wasn't love driving him. It was pain. Physical, constant, excruciating pain that I was the only remedy for. I remember the smell of the bacon burning on the stove in the kitchen while he talked, and how the sound of Mrs. Henderson's rooster crowing next door seemed to echo in the silence between his words. I remember looking at our wedding picture on the dresser. Me smiling bright as sunshine. Him looking handsome but somehow haunted even then, and realizing that the girl in that photograph had married a man she didn't really know at all. Arthur kept apologizing over and over, saying he should have told me before we wed, but he was afraid I wouldn't understand, afraid I'd run away like other girls had when they'd gotten a glimpse of what his life was really like. He said he loved me, that he truly did, but that he also needed me in a way that went beyond what most wives were expected to give their husbands. I asked him how often would I need to help him? The look that crossed his face when I asked that question, Lord help me, I can still see it clear as day 60 years later. He told me it could be several times a day, sometimes more, when the pain was particularly bad. That there would be times he'd wake me in the middle of the night because he couldn't bear it anymore. That this would be our life together, day in and day out, for as long as we both lived. I was 19 years old, had been married 6 weeks, and I was just beginning to understand that my body wasn't my own anymore. It belonged to Arthur's pain now. It was medicine, not a temple. A tool for relief, not an expression of love. But Arthur was my husband, and I'd made vows before God and everyone I loved. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, I thought this was the worse part, the sickness part, and that a good Christian wife would find a way to bear it with grace. I told him I understood. I told him I'd do whatever he needed me to do. I held him while he cried with relief and shame all mixed together, and I made a promise that would define the next 50 years of my life. I had no idea that the real test of that promise was still to come, or that Arthur's condition would demand things from me that no young woman should ever have to give. I thought I was agreeing to help my husband with a medical problem. I didn't know I was agreeing to become a prisoner in my own home. The first time I truly understood what my life was going to be like happened on a Sunday morning in November, about 3 months after Arthur told me about his condition. I remember it so clearly because it was the Sunday I was supposed to help serve communion at church, something I'd been looking forward to since I was a little girl, watching the older women perform that sacred duty. I'd laid out my best dress the night before, a navy blue one with tiny pearl buttons that my mama had sewn for me as a wedding gift. I'd even set my hair in pin curls, and had been planning to wear the little hat with the white flowers that Arthur had bought me for our honeymoon. I felt pretty that morning, felt normal, felt like the newlywed I was supposed to be. But when I woke up at 5:30 to get ready for the early service, Arthur was already awake beside me, that familiar look of desperate pain etched across his face. He was sweating even though the November air had turned cold enough to see our breath, and his whole body was rigid with the agony he was trying to contain. He didn't have to say anything. By then I'd learned to read the signs, the way his jaw clenched, the way his hands fisted in the bedsheets, the way he'd look at me with this mixture of love and absolute need that made my stomach twist into knots. I knew what he needed, and I knew that everything else, church, communion duty, my pretty dress, my normal Sunday morning, would have to wait. What I didn't expect was how long it would take that morning. Usually, Arthur found relief relatively quickly. But that day was different. The pain seemed deeper, more stubborn, and no matter what I did, no matter how I tried to help him, it wouldn't break. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. I watched the sun climb higher in the sky through our bedroom window, watched the shadows change on the wall, and knew that church was starting without me. I could hear the Hendersons' car starting up next door as they left for the 9 o'clock service, could hear the church bells ringing across town, calling everyone to worship while I was trapped in that bedroom, being a different kind of servant than I'd ever imagined I'd be. Arthur kept apologizing between his gasps of pain, kept saying he was sorry, that he knew I wanted to go to church, that he hated himself for needing me this way. But sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't get me out of that room or into my navy dress or up to the altar to serve communion like I'd dreamed of doing. Sorry didn't make me feel like a wife instead of a prescription that had to be taken multiple times a day. When it was finally over, when Arthur finally found the relief he needed and collapsed back against the pillows like a man who'd been drowning and finally reached shore, I looked at the clock and saw that it was past 11. Church was over. The communion had been served by someone else. My pretty dress was still hanging on the door, untouched. I sat on the edge of that bed, still in my nightgown, and felt something inside me crack. Not break completely, that would come later, but crack like ice on a pond when the weather starts to warm. I realized that this was going to be my life. Not just helping Arthur when it was convenient, not just being understanding about his condition, but being available every single time his body demanded it, no matter what else I might want or need to do. That afternoon, when folks from church came by to check on me, wondering why I hadn't shown up for communion duty, I told them I'd had a stomach bug. I smiled and thanked them for their concern, and promised I'd be fine by next Sunday. Arthur stood behind me in the doorway, his arm around my waist, looking like the devoted husband everyone thought he was, but I could feel the lie settling into my bones, like winter cold, could feel the distance growing between who I was supposed to be and who I was actually becoming. Mrs. Patterson from the Ladies' Auxiliary even commented on how lucky I was to have such an attentive husband, how Arthur clearly adored me and wanted to take such good care of me when I wasn't feeling well. If only she knew what kind of care I was really providing. That night, after everyone had gone home and Arthur had fallen asleep beside me, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about all the Sunday mornings that stretched ahead of me, all the church services I might miss, all the community events that would happen without me, all the normal life of a young married woman that I was already learning to live without. I thought about the other wives in town, how they complained about their husbands wanting intimacy too often, maybe twice a week. They'd whisper with rolled eyes at the church social. If only they knew that twice a week sounded like a vacation to me. If only they knew that their biggest marital burden was my impossible dream. I was starting to understand that I wasn't just married to Arthur. I was married to his pain, and his pain didn't care about church or community or the woman I thought I was going to become. That was the night I first wondered if this was what the rest of my life was going to look like, and the night I first understood that there might not be any escape from it. Spring came early to Hollow Pine in 1962, and with it came the news that changed everything again. I was 20 years old, had been married 8 months, and thought I understood the boundaries of my strange new life. I was wrong. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I finally worked up the courage to go see Dr. Morrison about the exhaustion that had been plaguing me for weeks. I'd been falling asleep in the middle of the day, could barely keep food down, and felt like I was walking through thick molasses most of the time. Arthur kept saying it was because I wasn't getting enough rest. And Lord knows that was true enough, with his condition waking me sometimes 3 times a night. But something felt different this time. Dr. Morrison was an old man who delivered half the babies in town, including me. He had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a gentle way of talking that made even the most embarrassing examinations bearable. When he finished his examination and told me to get dressed, there was something in his expression that made my heart start racing. I remember the smell of antiseptic in his office, the way the afternoon sun slanted through the Venetian blinds making stripes across his desk, the sound of his pen scratching across paper as he wrote notes. When he finally looked up at me, sitting there in my best dress with my hands folded in my lap like the good girl I'd been raised to be, he smiled in a way that was both congratulatory and somehow sad. He told me I was going to have a baby. A baby. After 8 months of marriage, 8 months of serving Arthur's relentless need, 8 months of my body belonging more to his pain than to me, I was finally going to have something that was truly mine. The joy that flooded through me in that moment was so pure, so overwhelming, that I started crying right there in Dr. Morrison's office. But then he kept talking, and the joy began to mix with something else. A cold dread that started in my stomach and spread outward like spilled ink. He told me that pregnancy could be complicated for women in my situation, that I'd need to be very careful, get plenty of rest, avoid any undue stress or physical strain. He looked at me over those wire-rimmed glasses with an expression that suggested he knew more about my marriage than I was comfortable with. Small towns have a way of making everyone's business public, even when people try to keep secrets. Dr. Morrison asked me if I had any questions about how this pregnancy might affect my marital duties. The way he said it, with such careful delicacy, made me realize that somehow someone had told him about Arthur's condition. Maybe Arthur himself had spoken to him. Or maybe the doctor had simply seen enough in his decades of practice to recognize the signs of a marriage like ours. I didn't know how to answer him. How do you tell your family doctor that your husband's medical condition requires intimate attention multiple times a day, and that you're terrified of what 9 months of pregnancy might do to that impossible routine? How do you explain that you're not sure if your body can handle growing a baby while also serving as constant medication for a man's chronic pain? Dr. Morrison must have seen the fear in my eyes because he leaned forward and spoke very quietly, very gently. He told me that there were ways to manage Arthur's condition during pregnancy, that I shouldn't feel obligated to accommodate him as frequently as I had been, that my health and the baby's health had to come first now. But even as he said those words, I knew they were meaningless. Arthur's pain didn't recognize pregnancy. It didn't care about doctor's orders or medical advice, or the tiny life growing inside me. The pain demanded what it demanded, when it demanded it, and I was still the only relief available. I walked home from Dr. Morrison's office that day with my head spinning. Part of me was overjoyed about the baby. I'd always wanted children, had dreamed of being a mother since I was a little girl playing with my dolls. But another part of me was terrified of how Arthur would react to the news, and what it would mean for our already complicated life together. When I told Arthur that evening, sitting at our kitchen table with the smell of pot roast filling the air and the sound of spring peepers singing outside our window, his reaction was everything I'd feared, and more. He was happy about the baby. Genuinely, deeply happy. But then he started talking about how this meant we'd need to be even more careful about managing his condition, how we couldn't let anything interfere with his treatment, how the baby would just have to fit into the routine we'd already established. That night, lying in bed with Arthur's hand resting on my still flat belly, I realized that my pregnancy wouldn't free me from my strange prison. If anything, it would make the bars stronger. Now I wasn't just responsible for managing Arthur's pain. I was responsible for protecting a baby while doing it. And somewhere in the darkness of that spring night, with the sound of Arthur's restless breathing beside me and the first fluttering hints of life inside me, I understood that my situation had just become impossible in a whole new way. What I didn't know yet was that this baby would be the first of many, and that each child would bind me tighter to a life I'd never chosen, but could never escape. James Arthur Walker was born on a snowy December morning in 1962, after 18 hours of labor that left me feeling like I'd been turned inside out and put back together wrong. He was beautiful. 8 pounds, 2 ounces of perfect baby boy, with Arthur's dark hair and my green eyes. When Dr. Morrison placed him in my arms for the first time, I felt a love so fierce and immediate that it actually scared me. But my recovery from childbirth became the first real test of how impossible my situation truly was. Dr. Morrison had been very clear with both Arthur and me that I needed at least 6 weeks to heal properly, before resuming marital relations. 6 weeks of rest, he said. 6 weeks to let my body recover from the trauma of birth. In most marriages, this would have been a period of tender care, of a husband helping his wife adjust to motherhood while she regained her strength. In my marriage, it became 6 weeks of watching Arthur spiral into a kind of agony I'd never seen before. Without his usual relief, Arthur's condition seemed to worsen dramatically. He'd pace the house at all hours, sweating and shaking, sometimes doubling over with pain so intense that he'd have to grab onto furniture to keep from falling. He tried cold baths, he tried exercise, he even tried drinking more than was proper for a church-going man. But nothing helped. The pain just built and built, like water behind a dam that was about to burst. I remember one night when James was maybe 2 weeks old. I woke up to the sound of Arthur crying in the bathroom. Not just tears, but deep, racking sobs that shook his whole body. I found him sitting on the floor in his nightclothes, his knees drawn up to his chest, rocking back and forth, like a child. When he saw me standing in the doorway holding our baby, he looked up at me with such desperation that my heart nearly broke. He begged me to help him, said he couldn't take it anymore, that he was going crazy with the pain, that 6 weeks might as well be 6 years. He promised he'd be gentle, promised he wouldn't hurt me, promised it would be quick. But when I reminded him what Dr. Morrison had said about my healing, Arthur's face crumpled like a man who'd just been told he was dying. That's when Mrs. Henderson next door started getting involved in ways that made everything so much worse. Mrs. Henderson had been watching Arthur's strange behavior through her kitchen window, seeing him pace the yard at 3 a.m, seeing him leave for work looking like he hadn't slept in days, seeing him come home and immediately disappear into the house without his usual friendly wave. She was a woman who prided herself on knowing everyone's business, and Arthur's obvious distress was too much for her to ignore. She started coming by every few days, ostensibly to check on me and the baby, but really to try to figure out what was wrong with my husband. She'd bring casseroles and baby clothes and advice I didn't ask for, all while studying Arthur with those sharp little eyes of hers. She'd make comments about how thin he was getting, how he seemed troubled, how maybe he needed to see a doctor or a pastor about whatever was bothering him. The worst part was that she was right to be concerned. Arthur was falling apart in ways that were becoming harder and harder to hide. He lost weight, developed dark circles under his eyes, and started having what I can only describe as fits of temper when the pain got too intense. He never hit me or the baby, but he'd slam doors, throw things, curse in ways that would have scandalized the church ladies if they'd heard him. One afternoon in late January, when James was about 6 weeks old, and I was finally beginning to feel physically normal again, Mrs. Henderson cornered me while I was hanging diapers on the line in our backyard. The wind was bitter cold, making the wet cloth freeze almost as soon as I pinned it up, and I was trying to work quickly so I could get back inside to the baby. She told me she was worried about Arthur, that she'd heard him making strange noises in the middle of the night, that she'd seen him talking to himself in the yard, like a man who was losing his mind. She asked me directly if everything was all right in our marriage, if Arthur was treating me properly, if there was anything she could do to help. Standing there in that frozen backyard with my neighbor's concerned eyes boring into me, I realized that our secret was on the verge of becoming public knowledge. Mrs. Henderson might not know the specific details of Arthur's condition, but she knew something was very wrong, and it was only a matter of time before she started sharing her concerns with other people in town. That night, after Dr. Morrison had given me the all-clear to resume normal marital activities, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I decided to give Arthur what he needed, not because I wanted to, or because I was ready, but because I was terrified of what would happen to our family's reputation if his breakdown became public knowledge. The relief on Arthur's face when I told him was both beautiful and horrible to see. He was so grateful, so desperate, that he actually kissed my hands and thanked me like I was granting him some incredible gift, instead of just doing what I felt I had to do to keep our lives from falling apart. But that night, as I lay there afterward feeling like I'd lost something I could never get back, I began to understand a truth that would define the next 50 years of my life. I wasn't just trapped by Arthur's condition anymore. I was trapped by the need to keep it secret, by the responsibility of protecting our family's standing in the community, by the fear of what people would say if they knew the truth about our marriage. And with a baby to protect now, the stakes had become higher than I'd ever imagined they could be. By the time James was walking and saying his first words, I was pregnant again. And then again. And again. The years between 1962 and 1970 became a blur of swollen bellies, sleepless nights, and the constant, relentless rhythm of Arthur's needs that never seemed to pause. Not even for the exhaustion of pregnancy or the demands of caring for small children. People in town started calling me blessed, fertile as the spring fields. They'd say with admiring smiles at the church social, the Lord has truly favored the Walker family. By 1968, I had 6 children under the age of 6, including a set of twins that nearly killed me during delivery. The house was always full of crying, laughing, the patter of little feet, and the smell of baby powder mixed with whatever I was cooking for dinner. From the outside, we looked like the picture of prosperity and divine blessing. Arthur had been promoted to supervisor at the grain elevator. We'd moved to a bigger house on Oak Street, with a proper parlor and 4 bedrooms, and I'd become one of those women that other women looked up to. "I don't know how she does it," they'd whisper when they thought I couldn't hear. 6 children, and she always looked so put together. What they couldn't see was the price I paid for that appearance. Arthur's condition hadn't improved with time. If anything, it had gotten worse. The stress of providing for a growing family, combined with his chronic pain, had turned him into a man I barely recognized from the charming suitor who'd courted me on my daddy's porch. He'd developed a short temper with everyone except me, would snap at the children for normal childhood noise, and had started drinking more than was proper for a church elder. But with me, he remained desperately, pathetically grateful. Every single time I helped him find relief from his pain, he'd thank me like it was the first time, like I was performing some act of incredible generosity, instead of just fulfilling what had become the central requirement of our marriage. The gratitude made it almost worse somehow. If he'd been demanding or cruel, I might have been able to feel justified in resenting him. But his appreciation, his obvious knowledge that what he was asking of me was beyond what most wives were expected to give, made me feel guilty for the growing anger I carried in my chest like a hot coal. The real crisis came in the spring of 1969, when I was 7 months pregnant with what would be our 7th child. I was exhausted beyond description, could barely keep up with the 6 children I already had, and my body felt like it was giving out under the constant demands placed on it. Arthur's needs hadn't lessened despite my condition. If anything, he seemed to need relief more frequently, as if the stress of our growing family was making his pain worse. It was on a Tuesday morning that I finally collapsed. I was in the kitchen making breakfast for the children, trying to get them ready for school, while also tending to 2-year-old Rebecca, who had been sick with a fever for 3 days. Arthur had already left for work, but not before waking me at 5 in the morning for relief from a particularly bad episode of pain. I remember standing at the stove, flipping pancakes with one hand, while bouncing Rebecca on my hip with the other, when suddenly the room started spinning. The next thing I knew, I was on the kitchen floor with 6-year-old James standing over me, shaking my shoulder and calling my name with panic in his little voice. The pancakes were burning on the stove, Rebecca was crying, and the other children were gathered around me with fear written across their faces. James, bless his heart, had the presence of mind to run next door and get Mrs. Henderson, who came bustling over in her housecoat and slippers to take charge of the situation. She got me to the couch, sent James to call Dr. Morrison, and managed to get the other children fed and off to school while we waited for the doctor to arrive. When Dr. Morrison examined me, his face was grave. My blood pressure was dangerously high. I was severely anemic, and he could see signs of what he called exhaustion of pregnancy, a condition that could be dangerous for both me and the baby if it wasn't managed properly. He prescribed complete bed rest for the remainder of my pregnancy, which meant no housework, no cooking, no caring for the children beyond basic supervision. Most importantly, he said in a voice that left no room for argument, I needed to avoid any physical stress or exertion that might tax my already overstrained system. Mrs. Henderson was in the room when he said this, and I saw the knowing look that passed between them. Dr. Morrison had been our family doctor long enough to understand the unusual demands of my marriage, and Mrs. Henderson had observed enough of Arthur's strange behavior to suspect that something wasn't normal about our relationship. Neither of them said anything directly, but the message was clear. Arthur would have to find other ways to manage his condition for the next 2 months. That evening, when I told Arthur what Dr. Morrison had said, his reaction was unlike anything I'd ever seen from him. He didn't argue or get angry. Instead, he just sat down at our kitchen table and put his head in his hands. When he looked up at me, there were tears streaming down his face, and he looked like a man who'd just been sentenced to death. He asked me what we were going to do, how he was supposed to survive 2 months without relief, whether Dr. Morrison had suggested any alternatives. When I told him I didn't know, that we'd just have to trust that God would provide a way through this trial, Arthur's face took on an expression that frightened me more than his pain ever had. It was the look of a man who was considering options I didn't want to think about. That night, lying in bed on doctor's orders while Arthur paced the floor beside me like a caged animal, I began to realize that my pregnancy had created a crisis that neither of us knew how to solve. Arthur's pain wouldn't pause for bed rest orders, and my body couldn't handle the demands he needed to place on it. For the first time in our marriage, I began to wonder if there were some problems that love and duty and Christian obligations simply couldn't solve. The 2 months of bed rest that Dr. Morrison ordered turned into the longest, most terrifying period of our marriage up to that point. I spent those weeks lying in our bedroom, watching Arthur deteriorate in ways that made me fear for his sanity, and, if I'm being honest, for the safety of our family. Without his usual relief, Arthur became a stranger in his own home. He'd disappear for hours at a time, driving the back roads around Hollow Pine in his old Ford pickup, coming home with his knuckles bloody from hitting the steering wheel or the dashboard when the pain became unbearable. Some nights I'd hear him in the basement, moving things around, building something, or tearing something apart. I never found out what, because I was too afraid to ask and too weak to investigate. The children began to fear their father in ways that broke my heart. Little James, who had always been eager to help his daddy with chores around the house, started avoiding Arthur altogether. The twins would run to hide behind my skirts whenever they heard Arthur's footsteps on the front porch. Even baby Rebecca, who wasn't yet old enough to understand what was happening, would cry whenever Arthur came near her. Mrs. Henderson started coming by every day, ostensibly to help with the children and the housework, but really to keep an eye on our family. She'd bring casseroles and do the washing, all while watching Arthur with those sharp eyes of hers, taking note of his increasingly erratic behavior. I could see her making mental notes about the way he'd slam doors, the way he'd mutter to himself while pacing the kitchen, the way he'd sometimes stop mid-sentence and clutch his abdomen like he'd been stabbed. The worst part was that I could see she was starting to form her own theories about what was wrong with our marriage. Small-town gossip has a way of filling in blanks with whatever seems most scandalous, and I could tell from the careful way she asked about my health, about whether Arthur was treating me right, that she was beginning to suspect some form of marital abuse. In early June, about 6 weeks into my bed rest, something happened that nearly exposed our secret to the entire town. I was lying in bed one afternoon, trying to rest while Mrs. Henderson watched the children downstairs, when I heard Arthur's truck roar into the driveway with an urgency that made my heart race. He came charging up the stairs, burst into our bedroom, and I could see immediately that he was in the grip of the worst pain episode I'd ever witnessed. His face was gray with agony, his shirt was soaked with sweat, and he was shaking so violently that he could barely stand. He fell to his knees beside our bed and begged me to help him, said he couldn't take it anymore, that 2 months might as well be 2 years, that he was starting to think about things that scared him. When I reminded him what Dr. Morrison had said about my condition, about the danger to me and the baby, Arthur's face crumpled with despair. That's when he told me something that changed everything I thought I understood about our situation. He said he'd been thinking about driving to Lincoln, maybe finding one of those women who provided services to men like him. Said he'd heard other men talking about such places, and that maybe it would be better for everyone if he found relief elsewhere, rather than risking my health and the baby's life. The thought of Arthur with another woman, even under these circumstances, hit me like a physical blow. Not because I was jealous. God help me. Part of me was actually relieved at the idea of someone else shouldering this burden. But because I knew what it would mean for our family if word ever got out. In a town like Hollow Pine, a man visiting prostitutes would be a scandal that would destroy not just Arthur's reputation, but mine and the children's as well. I could see Mrs. Henderson downstairs through our bedroom window, hanging laundry on the line, and probably listening to every word of our conversation through the thin walls of our old house. I realized that our marriage was balanced on a knife's edge, and that any solution to Arthur's problem was going to come with consequences I couldn't predict or control. That night, after Arthur had finally exhausted himself with pacing and collapsed into a fitful sleep beside me, I lay awake thinking about the impossible choice I was facing. I could continue to refuse him and watch him either lose his mind or seek relief in ways that would destroy our family's reputation, or I could risk my own health and the baby's life by giving him what he needed. As I felt the baby moving restlessly inside me, as if sensing the tension that filled our house like smoke, I realized that there were no good options left. Every path forward seemed to lead to some form of destruction, and I was the one who would have to choose which kind of ruin we'd face. Dr. Morrison had warned me that stress could be as dangerous to my pregnancy as physical exertion. But how do you avoid stress when your entire life has become an impossible situation with no solution in sight? 3 weeks before my due date, as I lay there listening to Arthur's tortured breathing and the sound of summer rain against our bedroom window, I finally understood that some prisons don't have keys. Some situations don't have solutions. Sometimes all you can do is choose which form of suffering you can live with, and pray that God will give you the strength to survive whatever choice you make. But I had no idea that the real test of my endurance was still coming, or that the birth of our 7th child would mark the beginning of the most difficult period of our marriage yet. Sarah Beth Walker came into this world on July 15th, 1969, 3 weeks early, and weighing barely 5 pounds. The labor was quick but brutal, and afterward Dr. Morrison took one look at me, pale as a sheet, weak as a newborn kitten myself, and declared that this had to be my last pregnancy for at least 2 years, maybe longer. He pulled Arthur aside while I was still recovering, and had what I could only assume was a very frank conversation about my health and what another pregnancy so soon might do to me. When Arthur came back into the room, his face was stricken, but underneath the concern I could see something else. A kind of desperate calculation, like a man trying to solve an impossible mathematical equation. The first month after Sarah Beth's birth was like walking through a minefield. Arthur tried, Lord knows he tried, to manage his condition without involving me. He'd disappear into the bathroom for long periods, would take cold showers at all hours. He even tried some kind of herbal remedies that old Doc Patterson had suggested when Arthur finally worked up the courage to ask for advice. But nothing worked for long, and I could see him deteriorating again in the same way he had during my bed rest. The children started tiptoeing around the house, sensing their father's volatile mood, even if they didn't understand the cause. Mrs. Henderson's visits became more frequent, her questions more pointed, and I could feel the walls closing in around our family's carefully maintained secret. It was on a sweltering August morning, when Sarah Beth was about 6 weeks old, that I made the decision that would define the rest of my marriage. I was sitting in the kitchen at dawn, feeding the baby while trying to plan the day's meals for our family of 9, when Arthur came downstairs looking like he hadn't slept in a week. His hands were shaking as he poured his coffee, and when he sat down across from me at the table I could see the desperation in his eyes that I'd come to know so well. He didn't say anything. By then we'd developed a language of looks and silences that spoke louder than words ever could, but I could see him struggling with something. Could see him working up the courage to ask me for something he knew I wasn't ready to give. That's when I realized that this situation was bigger than my own comfort or recovery, or even Dr. Morrison's medical advice. We had 7 children who needed their father to be functional, who needed him to keep his job at the grain elevator and maintain his standing in the community. We had a reputation to protect, a family to shelter from scandal, a life that had been built on the foundation of keeping Arthur's condition secret. I looked at my husband across that kitchen table, this man who had never chosen his affliction any more than I had chosen to be his remedy, and I made a decision that came from duty rather than desire, from pragmatism rather than love. I told him we'd find a way to make things work, that we'd be more careful, more gentle, but that I understood what he needed and what our family needed, and that somehow we'd manage it all. The relief that flooded across Arthur's face was so complete, so overwhelming, that he actually started crying right there at the breakfast table. He reached across and took my free hand, the one that wasn't supporting baby Sarah Beth, and held it like I'd just saved his life, which, in a way, I suppose I had. But as I sat there with my newborn daughter in my arms, and my husband's grateful tears falling onto our joined hands, I felt something inside me shut down permanently. It wasn't my love for Arthur, which had always been more about duty than passion anyway. It wasn't my love for my children, which burned as bright as ever. It was something else, some part of myself that had belonged to me alone, some small corner of my soul that I'd managed to keep private even through all the demands of my strange marriage. That morning, feeding my baby while promising my husband that his needs would continue to come before my own healing, I gave away the last piece of myself that I'd been holding in reserve. From that day forward, there would be no part of me that wasn't in service to someone else's requirements. The years that followed blurred together in a haze of pregnancies, births, sleepless nights, and the constant, unrelenting rhythm of Arthur's condition. By 1975, we had 10 children. 10 beautiful, healthy children who were the joy of my life and the proof of what our marriage had cost me. Each pregnancy had been harder than the last, each recovery shorter, each return to my duties as Arthur's relief more difficult to bear. People in town called me a saint. The pastor at Oak Street Baptist would hold me up as an example of Christian womanhood, the kind of wife who understood that marriage was about sacrifice and service. The other women would look at me with a mixture of admiration and bewilderment, wondering how I managed to keep house, raise children, and always have a smile ready for church on Sunday mornings. If only they knew that my sainthood was just another form of prison, and that sometimes the most virtuous-looking life is actually the most trapped one of all. But even as I settled into this routine of endless giving, even as I accepted that my body and my time and my energy would never truly belong to me again, I had no idea that the most difficult test of my endurance was still to come, because Arthur's condition wasn't just affecting our marriage anymore. It was starting to affect our children in ways that would force me to confront just how far I was willing to go to protect the secret that had become the foundation of our entire family's existence. The moment that changed everything happened on a cold February night in 1975. When our oldest boy James was 15, and old enough to understand things no child should have to understand about his parents' marriage. I remember that night so clearly because it was the night I realized our secret was about to destroy more than just me. It was about to poison the very children I'd been trying to protect all these years. It had been a particularly difficult day. Arthur's pain had been worse than usual, maybe because of the bitter cold that had settled over Hollow Pine like a frozen blanket. Or maybe because the stress of providing for 10 children was finally taking its toll on his body as much as his mind. He'd come home from the grain elevator looking gray and shaken, had barely touched his dinner, and I could see that familiar desperation building in his eyes like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The younger children were all in bed by 8 o'clock. But James and our second oldest, Michael, who was 13, was still up doing homework at the kitchen table. I was washing dishes, trying to keep my hands busy while watching Arthur pace back and forth between the kitchen and the living room, like a man looking for something he'd lost but couldn't name. By 9 o'clock, Arthur's pacing had become more urgent, and I could see the sweat beading on his forehead despite the February cold. He kept catching my eye across the room, that look passing between us that had become as familiar as breathing over the years. But with the boys still downstairs, still wide awake and working on their arithmetic, I couldn't give him what he needed. I tried to send James and Michael to bed, made up some excuse about needing to clean the kitchen, but James, Lord help me, James had always been too smart for his own good, looked from his father's increasingly agitated state to my nervous face, and said he wasn't tired yet, that he wanted to finish his homework downstairs where the light was better. Arthur's condition continued to worsen. By 10 o'clock, he was clutching the back of chairs to steady himself, his jaw clenched so tight I was afraid he might crack his teeth. The boys had finally noticed their father's strange behavior, and I could see Michael shooting worried glances at James, who was watching Arthur with the kind of careful attention that told me he was starting to piece together things I'd prayed he'd never figure out. That's when Arthur made the mistake that exposed everything, unable to bear the pain any longer, and perhaps forgetting that the boys were still in the room. Arthur came over to where I was standing at the sink and grabbed my arm, not hard enough to hurt me, but firmly enough that James and Michael both looked up from their books. His voice was low and desperate when he spoke, but in the quiet of that February night, every word carried clearly across the kitchen. He told me he couldn't wait any longer, said the pain was getting worse by the minute, and he needed me to come upstairs with him right now. He promised it would be quick, that he'd be as gentle as he could, but that he simply couldn't endure another minute without relief. The silence that followed those words was so complete. I could hear the old clock ticking on the mantelpiece in the next room, could hear the wind rattling the windows, could hear my own heart pounding like it was trying to escape from my chest. James stood up from the kitchen table so slowly, it seemed like the movement took forever. His face had gone pale, and when he looked at me, I saw something in his 15-year-old eyes that no mother should ever have to see in her child's face. Understanding mixed with disgust, pity mixed with anger, and a kind of loss of innocence that could never be undone. Michael, younger and not quite grasping the full meaning of what had just happened, looked confused and frightened. But James understood exactly what his father had been asking for, exactly what kind of relief he needed, and exactly what my role had been in providing it all these years. Arthur realized his mistake the moment he saw James's expression. The pain seemed to leave his face for a moment, replaced by pure horror at what he'd just revealed to his own son. He tried to explain, tried to say something about not feeling well and needing medicine. But the damage was already done. The careful facade we'd maintained for 15 years had crumbled in a single moment of desperation. James didn't say anything. He just looked at me for a long moment, with those knowing eyes, then gathered up his books and walked upstairs to his room. Michael followed, still confused but sensing that something terrible had just happened in our kitchen. I stood there at the sink with my hands dripping dishwater onto the linoleum floor, looking at Arthur's stricken face, and realized that our secret was no longer ours alone. Our 15-year-old son now knew things about his parents' marriage that would change how he saw us, how he saw the world, how he understood what marriage was supposed to be for the rest of his life. Arthur's physical pain seemed forgotten in the face of this new horror. He sat down heavily at the kitchen table and put his head in his hands. And for the first time in our marriage, I saw him cry. Not from physical agony, but from shame so complete it seemed to break something inside him. That night, after Arthur had finally found the relief he needed and fallen into an exhausted sleep, I lay awake thinking about James upstairs in his room, probably staring at the ceiling and trying to process what he'd learned about his family. I thought about Michael, who might not understand everything yet, but who had seen his father's desperation and his mother's compliance. I thought about our 8 other children, still innocent of the truth that held our family together and slowly poisoned it at the same time. For the first time in 15 years of marriage, I began to wonder if the price of keeping Arthur functional was finally becoming too high. Not for me. I'd made my peace with that sacrifice long ago. But for our children, who deserved better than to grow up thinking that marriage was about one person's needs, consuming another person's entire existence. But even as I lay there questioning everything I'd accepted for so long, I knew that there was no going back. The secret was out, at least partially, and now I had to figure out how to protect my children from the truth that was already starting to destroy the innocence I'd worked so hard to preserve. The conversation I had with James 3 days after that terrible February night changed everything I thought I knew about my own son and about the strength that can grow in the darkest places. I found him sitting on the front porch steps after school, even though the temperature was barely above freezing and his breath was making little clouds in the air. He'd been avoiding me since that night in the kitchen, wouldn't meet my eyes at breakfast, would disappear to his room right after dinner. I knew I couldn't let things go on like that, couldn't let this poison spread through our family without at least trying to explain. I sat down beside him on those cold wooden steps, wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and waited. James had always been a thoughtful boy, one who needed time to work through his feelings before he could put them into words. After a few minutes of sitting there in the winter silence, he finally spoke. What he said shocked me more than anything that had happened in our kitchen 3 nights before. He told me he'd known something was wrong for years. Not the specifics, not the medical details, but he'd known that his father needed something from me that went beyond what normal marriages required. He'd heard the late-night movements in our bedroom, had seen my exhaustion that went deeper than what caring for 10 children should cause, had noticed how his father's moods correlated with how much time I spent behind our closed bedroom door. But then James said something that nearly broke my heart and put it back together at the same time. He told me he'd been saving money from his part-time job at Miller's hardware store, not for a car or for college like I'd assumed, but because he'd been planning to help me leave if I ever decided I couldn't take it anymore. My 15-year-old son had been carrying his own secret for years, watching his mother's sacrifice and preparing to be her salvation if she ever asked for it. I started crying right there on those front steps, and James put his arm around my shoulders like he was the parent, and I was the child. He told me he didn't understand all the details of his father's condition, but he understood enough to know that I'd been carrying a burden that wasn't fair, that wasn't normal, and that wasn't my fault. That's when I told him everything about Arthur's priapism, about the constant pain, about the choice I'd made as an 18-year-old bride to become his relief, about the way that choice had shaped every day of our marriage and every decision about our family. James listened without judgment, asking quiet questions when he needed clarification, holding my hand when the telling became too difficult. When I finished, we sat there in the cold for a long time, both of us thinking about what this truth meant for our family going forward. Finally, James asked me the question I'd been dreading. Did I want to leave? Did I want him to help me take the younger children and start over somewhere else? The answer that came out of my mouth surprised both of us. I told him no, not because I was afraid or because I didn't think I could survive on my own, but because Arthur's condition wasn't his fault any more than my situation was mine. We were both trapped by circumstances neither of us had chosen, and after 15 years of marriage and 10 children, we'd built a life that worked, even if it wasn't the life either of us would have designed for ourselves. But I also told James that things were going to change, that now that he knew the truth, he could help me in ways I'd never been able to ask for help before, that we could work together to protect the younger children, while also making sure Arthur's needs were met in ways that didn't consume every hour of every day. James became my ally in ways I'd never expected a child could be. He started taking on more responsibilities with his younger siblings, giving me breaks when Arthur's pain was particularly bad. He learned to recognize the signs of his father's difficult days and would quietly orchestrate activities that kept the other children occupied and out of the house. Most importantly, he became someone I could talk to about the weight I'd been carrying alone for so many years. Arthur's condition didn't improve with time. If anything, it worsened as he got older. But having James as a partner in managing our family's complex needs made the burden bearable in ways it had never been before. By the time our youngest, little Mary, started school in 1978, we'd developed a rhythm that worked for everyone, even if it wasn't conventional. Arthur lived until 1995, when a heart attack took him quietly in his sleep at the age of 62. I think, in some ways, his heart had just gotten tired of fighting the constant battle his body demanded of it. At his funeral, people talked about what a devoted husband he'd been, how he'd never missed a day of work, how he'd provided so well for his large family. They had no idea how true that devotion really was, or what it had cost both of us. Now, at 82, I look back on those 50 years of marriage not with bitterness, but with a kind of amazed pride at what we all survived together. My 10 children grew up to be good people, kind, strong, resilient adults who learned early that families sometimes carry burdens that the outside world can't see or understand. They learned that love isn't always romantic or easy, that sometimes it's just the decision to keep showing up for each other day after day, even when the circumstances are impossible. James never married, and I sometimes wonder if what he witnessed in our house made him afraid of the ways that love can become complicated. But he stayed close, helped me through Arthur's final years, and has been my greatest support in the decade since Arthur's passing. I tell you this story not because I want pity, or because I think what happened to me was fair. I tell it because I learned something in that house on Oak Street that I think might matter to someone else who's carrying an impossible burden right now. I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do isn't to fight, or to run, or to demand that life be different than it is. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is to find ways to survive with grace, to protect the people you love from the worst of your pain, and to build something beautiful even in the midst of circumstances that seem designed to break you. My children were my joy, my salvation, and my proof that even the most difficult marriages can produce something good and lasting. They are my legacy, not the sacrifice I made for their father, and they have gone on to build families of their own that are healthier and happier than what they grew up with. If you're listening to this story and you're carrying your own secret burden, if you're trapped in circumstances that feel impossible to escape, I want you to know that survival is a form of victory too. That making it through each day with your kindness intact, your love for your family unbroken, and your hope for the future still flickering, that's not settling for less than you deserve. That's heroism of the quietest, strongest kind. I'm still here, still standing, still finding reasons to get up each morning and tend my garden and bake pies for the church social. Arthur's pain is finally over, and mine has become something different. Not the sharp daily struggle it once was, but a deeper understanding of what people can endure when they have to, and what grace can look like when it's lived out in small, daily acts of love. My story traveled through pain to find its way to peace, and if you're hearing it today, then maybe it can help your own story find its way to something better too. If my words have touched something in your heart, I hope you'll share this with someone else who might need to hear that they're not alone, that their struggles matter, and that there's always a way forward, even when the path isn't clear. I want to know where my voice is reaching today. What city are you watching this from? Tell me in the comments below, because even at 82, I'm still learning that connection and understanding can bloom in the most unexpected places. And if you think someone else needs to hear this story, if you believe there's another soul out there carrying their own heavy secret, then help my words find their way by subscribing and sharing this with them. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is just the knowledge that we're not walking our difficult roads alone.